Hey everybody, Sarah Nova again. So we have been talking about doing perhaps a little deeper dive on some of the nitty gritty stuff, geeking out on some of the more, perhaps mundane and boring things. No, not mundane, but perhaps boring to some things, like the details of building an engine and what you get into when you're building a special engine, something like that. So we've already started. We get into some of that stuff with some of the other things. I can't help myself sometimes, but this is going to be a little deeper for people who want to know how to do something specific or how I'm going to be doing something specific because I'm not always an expert. I just like to do stuff. This is the crankshaft off my Velocette race bike project, which is, again, a refresher. I'm building a short stroke 350cc Velocette motor out of a 250cc crankshaft and a 500cc piston. Taking a MAC motor and, it started as a 500cc piston. It has evolved into using a BSA 441 piston and cylinder. So I can have an aluminum jug and high enough compression to make it worthwhile. And so the whole thing comes out to about 350cc. And this is back to the original. This is my crank, which I started off the project with, and then I moved away from it to work on the piston and the cylinder head and stuff. So now we're back to it. I am doing I'm balancing the crank basically. So it is exactly what it sounds like. You want it to balance so that it's not imbalanced in certain areas. The funny part about it, though, is if you've ever been, reading deep into motor literature, you've heard about something called the balance factor. And that is, you don't balance this 100%. When you balance a tire for your car or for a motorcycle, obviously, you balance that 100%. So that anywhere in the rotation, it's going to be evenly turning. If you were to balance this 100%, you'd basically be offsetting the weight of the piston and the con rod and stuff like that on the other side. If you turn it sideways, it would still, anywhere, it would never be fully balanced. So, the vibrations would be terrible. The thing about balancing a crank is you're never going to get vibrations to not be bad. What you're doing is you're moving them around to the place where you don't want to be riding. So if you have a high RPM motor, it's okay if it's vibrating down low. If you have a motor that's going to be spent most of the time touring around, cruising around town, starting and going, and low RPM rumbling, you want to move the vibrations up high where you're not going to spend time. So that's what the balance factor is about. It's about balancing it to a degree that works for what you're using it for. The Velocette settled on 70%, and I have not found a reason not to use 70%. What that means is you balance it so that opposite your piston pin holding the con rod, which holds your piston, etc. Opposite that, you want to have it balanced to 70% of what your piston pin, the one half of your con rod, and your circlip weighs. So, sounds a little complicated, but basically the reciprocating mass is what you're balancing against. What is called the reciprocating mass is your piston pin, the circlips, your piston rings, and then just, for argument's sake, half of your con rod. Half of it is considered to be rotating, which means it's just going around in a circle. You don't have to worry about that because that's balanced. And then the reciprocating part is what you have to compensate for. So they just take half of your con rod. So you measure all that, you weigh it out on your little scale, and then you take that number and you multiply it by 70%. And then you weights and magnets. I have a collection of nuts, bolts, and magnets that I weigh out. So 70% of my total, weigh that, and I attach it to the end of the con rod. And then I put weights on the other side until I get it so that it basically will rotate and not try to turn itself back around again. So I'm pretty darn close here. It's not perfect, but without these weights on here, it was just completely obviously wanting to go very quickly back around to the piston pin on the bottom being heavy. Now, technique I'm using to put weights on is I've drilled a couple holes here on each side of the crank cheeks, and I'm using these little bits of tungsten, which are just very, very dense, denser than steel, denser than lead, and using them. So each one of these, I think, is about 40 grams. So that's quite a bit. I can get a lot of weight in a small area. And I had already drilled 2 holes before, so I popped pieces in on each side, and that wasn't enough. So I just taped another 2 up here and that gets me in the ballpark. Now, at this point, before I commit to anything else, I'm going to go back and double check all my weights, double check my balance, and then once I do that, I will drill another hole for these tungstens. Actually, I'll have to do that first because I'm going to take some metal out when I drill that hole. Do that, double check everything again. I may have to take some weight off elsewhere. I've also started off by taking off some weight up here. It's another method. Instead of adding weight to the other side, you can take weight off of the crank pin side. So I've done that already. I may have to make those holes a little bigger, do something once to finalize what I'm taking off over here. And then I will braze those into place so they don't come out when we're running. And then once I do that, I'm going to do the final truing of the crank. It was trued before, but I've been working it a bit. And then I will weld the crank pins in place, the crank pin in place, and the main shafts in place. Once we do that, we can start to build the bottom end for real, and it will hopefully stay together for a season or 2 or 3. So that's what I'm doing on balancing this crank. You know, fun to get into this stuff. It's very tedious. It's very slow, and but hopefully it's all worthwhile.